Me, my friend Emma, and our two other best friends decided to rent a beach house for spring break. We found this place about 2 hours from where we lived, reasonably priced because it wasn't exactly on the main strip, but that was perfect for us. We weren't big party people anyway. We just wanted to chill by ourselves. The house was a simple 2-story structure, probably a couple decades old. Nothing fancy, but it had everything we needed. We spent our first day exactly how we'd planned. As evening came, we gathered on the porch with wine and cheese, watching the sunset paint the sky in these brilliant oranges and purples. We decided to share the big upstairs bedroom that overlooked the ocean. As it got dark on our second night, we decided to build a bonfire on the beach. We dragged blankets from the house and settled around the flames with our wine. The fire cast this warm circle of light around us, but beyond that, the beach stretched into complete darkness. We'd been out there maybe an hour when Maya pointed towards something in the distance. There was this faint light moving along the shoreline, maybe half a mile down the beach. At first, we figured it was just another group taking a night walk. The area was pretty remote, and most of the neighboring houses were weekend places that often sat empty. As the light got nearer, we could make out what looked like 3 figures walking along the water's edge. Jess suggested we should probably head back to the house, but Maya said we were being paranoid. The strangers eventually got close enough for us to hear their voices. When they spotted our fire, one of them called out a greeting that sounded friendly enough. Emma responded politely, and soon the 3 men had walked over to our little circle. They looked like they were in their late 20s or early 30s, dressed casually in shorts and t-shirts. One introduced himself as Derek, and explained that they were staying at a rental house further down the coast. They'd seen our fire and decided to come say hi. Derek and his friends seemed harmless. Maya and Jess seemed particularly charmed. When Derek suggested we join them at their rental house for more drinks and better music, I noticed my friends exchanging interested glances. Despite my growing unease, I found myself outvoted. Derek assured us their place was only a short walk down the beach, and Maya was already gathering her things with obvious excitement. Emma seemed torn between being polite and being cautious, but ultimately went along with the group. The walk to their supposed rental house took way longer than Derek had suggested. We trudged through soft sand in near-complete darkness, guided only by Derek's flashlight and occasional glimpses of lights from distant properties. After nearly 20 minutes, I started questioning whether they actually knew where they were going. When we finally reached this large, modern house set back from the beach, something immediately felt wrong. The property was completely dark, except for a single porch light, and Derek had to fumble with keys for several minutes before getting the door open. Once inside, the house felt cold and unused, like no one had been staying there at all. The interior was sparsely furnished with generic rental furniture, but there were no personal belongings anywhere. No suitcases, no food in the kitchen, no signs that anyone had been living there. When I mentioned this to Jess, she whispered back that maybe they were just really neat travelers. Derek suggested we sit on the deck overlooking the ocean while his friends went to get drinks. Maya and Jess settled into deck chairs, still chatting about the evening's adventure, but I stayed standing near the sliding door. When Derek's friends came back with bottles of beer, I noticed they'd also brought what looked like a small black bag. Something about their whole demeanor had shifted. Emma caught my eye and gave this almost imperceptible shake of her head. She'd clearly reached the same conclusion I had. We needed to leave immediately. She stood up and announced that she was feeling tired and thought we should head back. The sudden tension in Derek's voice when he protested was unmistakable. Everything deteriorated rapidly from there. When Emma insisted we were leaving, Derek's friends moved to block our path to the deck stairs. Maya and Jess finally seemed to realize something was seriously wrong, but by then it was too late for a casual exit. Derek's whole demeanor had completely changed, and he made it clear he didn't think we should be going anywhere. In the chaos that followed, Emma managed to break away and run toward the beach, while the men were focused on stopping the rest of us from leaving. I heard her footsteps disappearing into the darkness, and desperately hoped she'd make it back to our house and call for help. Maya and Jess were clearly in shock, and I focused entirely on trying to keep everyone calm while we waited for a chance to escape. The men seemed uncertain about their next moves. When police sirens finally cut through the night air, I felt this wave of relief so intense, it was almost overwhelming. Emma had made it safely back to our house and called 911 immediately. The officers arrived to find Derek and his friends scrambling to clean up what was clearly evidence of their true intentions: restraints, drugs, and other items that painted a terrifying picture of what they'd planned for us. The investigation revealed that these three men had been targeting groups of young women at various beach locations throughout the summer, using the same friendly approach and invitation strategy. The house where they'd taken us was indeed a rental, but one they'd gotten using fake IDs. All three were eventually convicted on multiple charges related to kidnapping and assault. If Emma hadn't been quick enough to escape and get help, I don't want to think about what would have happened to us that night. This happened a couple years ago. My cousin Sarah had offered me her family's beach house in the Outer Banks for a long weekend while she was traveling for work. After grinding through my first year of graduate school with basically no money for any kind of vacation, I jumped at the chance. The drive took nearly 4 hours, winding through increasingly narrow roads, until I finally turned onto this gravel driveway that disappeared into a tunnel of overhanging branches. When the house finally came into view, it looked like something straight out of a postcard. Definitely weathered and worn, but beautiful in that coastal way. Sarah called it Tides Creek House. Like most beach properties, it sat up on stilts with the main living area elevated well above flood level. Underneath, there were storage areas and an outdoor shower that created these dark, shadowy spaces. The property was completely isolated. Sarah had left instructions and a key under the welcome mat. Inside, everything had that faded, sun-bleached look that comes from years of salt air. The master bedroom upstairs had these tall windows overlooking the creek. I could hear water gently lapping against the dock pilings below. After settling in and making dinner, I sat out on the deck with a few drinks, just enjoying the peace and quiet. The next day, I woke up around 8:30 and took a long walk on the beach before it got too hot. I spent most of the day just hanging around the house, trying not to think about all the stress waiting for me back home. That night, around midnight, I woke up to what sounded like footsteps outside. I sat up in bed, my heart already racing. Through the bedroom window, I could see the driveway clearly lit up by motion sensor lights, but there was nothing there. I waited for several minutes, listening as carefully as I could, but everything was silent. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next morning, I checked around the driveway where the lights had triggered. Nothing looked disturbed. I figured it was probably just a raccoon or something and decided to forget about it. I spent most of that day in the nearest village, grocery shopping and getting some change of scenery. In the afternoon, I could see storm clouds building, so I headed back to avoid getting caught in the rain. I made it just in time. The rain started coming down hard right after I got inside. While I was stuck indoors during the storm, I found this old photo album documenting decades of family gatherings at the house. There were pictures of kids playing in the same rooms where I was sitting, adults around the same dining table, celebrations that had filled these walls with laughter. Around 10 o'clock, while I was washing dishes in the kitchen, something caught my ears. I turned off the water and listened closely. At that point, I was certain that I could hear voices. It wasn't conversation, but a low murmur of people speaking. just beyond the range where I could make out words. The sound seemed to be coming up through the floorboards from the storage areas beneath the house. I stood perfectly still, trying to figure out what I was hearing, but the voices faded into the background noise of wind and water. I tried to convince myself that sound just carried strangely along the water. Maybe voices from neighboring properties or boats on the creek were somehow echoing through the structure. The explanation felt weak, but I'd rather believe that than let my imagination run wild. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay awake, hyper-aware of every sound the old house made. Every noise seemed amplified in the darkness, and I kept holding my breath, listening for sounds that didn't belong. Sometime after midnight, the voices came back. Clearer this time. There were definitely multiple people speaking somewhere close to me. I still couldn't make out words, but I could tell there were at least 2 different voices having what sounded like an agitated discussion. My heart started pounding as I crept from the bedroom to the top of the staircase, hoping to get a better sense of what I was hearing. The moment I moved, the voices stopped completely. I waited at the top of the stairs for nearly 20 minutes, but they never started up again. Sunday morning brought bright sunlight and the normal sounds of boats on the creek. In daylight, my middle-of-the-night panic seemed ridiculous. Still, I wanted to inspect. I walked around the entire property, checking the storage areas under the house for any signs that someone had been there. But I found nothing unusual apart from typical beach house stuff covered with tarps. I called Sarah that afternoon and mentioned hearing what sounded like voices near the property, but I could tell she wasn't taking me very seriously, explaining that sound traveled in weird ways along the water, especially at night when conditions changed. Sometimes boaters anchored in the creek, she said, and their conversations could carry surprising distances. Her explanation made somewhat sense, but I wasn't convinced. I also didn't want to bother her with it any longer, so I decided not to push it. That evening, I packed my stuff and got ready for an early departure the next morning. Despite the nighttime weirdness, the weekend had been exactly what I needed. I decided to stay up later than usual, hoping to catch the source of the voices if they came back, just to confirm Sarah's explanation about sound traveling across water. Around 11:30, as I sat reading on the screened porch, I heard a car engine coming slowly down the gravel drive. The motion sensor lights flickered on, illuminating a dark sedan that stopped just at the edge of the light. The engine shut off, and 2 figures got out of the car. Even from my position up on the porch, I could see them examining the house carefully, pointing at different parts of it and speaking in voices too low for me to understand. They moved like they knew the property well, walking straight toward the storage areas under the house without any hesitation. That's when it hit me. These were the voices I'd been hearing. Not boaters on the creek. Real people had been coming onto the property at night, using the space under the house for God knows what. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my phone and called the local police. I explained to the dispatcher that I was staying at a family property and people were trespassing on the land after dark. She said an officer would respond, but warned me that response times in rural coastal areas could be pretty long. I stayed on the porch, watching the strangers below, who thankfully weren't able to see me in the dark. They were unloading stuff from their car and carrying it toward the storage areas. The way they moved made it clear this wasn't their first time here. About 20 minutes later, I saw blue lights flickering through the trees as a patrol car made its way down the gravel drive. The moment the strangers saw the lights, they immediately stopped what they were doing and rushed back to their car. By the time the officer parked and got out, the sedan was already backing rapidly toward the main road. The officer was this middle-aged guy who looked like he'd been working the job out here for years. He listened to what I told him, then explained that the area had been having problems with people using vacant properties for drug deals, taking advantage of the isolation and all the escape routes provided by the waterways. He told me he'd make sure patrols in the area were increased, and suggested I contact the property owners about better security. The strangers didn't come back before I left the next morning, but knowing that people had been using the property without permission left me completely unsettled. I called Sarah from the road, explaining everything that had happened and recommending that her and her family consider upgrading their security. She thanked me for calling the police and mentioned they'd been thinking about cameras for a while, but hadn't wanted to change the peaceful character of their retreat, so I don't know if they ever went through with it. I, for one, have never ever been back to that beach house. My friend Jake owned this massive 3-story beach house that had been in his family for decades. When he invited me down for a weekend in August, I jumped at the chance. We'd both been grinding through these brutal summer internships, and honestly, I needed the break. When we finally pulled up to Jake's place, I was blown away. This thing was huge. Inside, it had that classic beach house vibe. You know the smell. Salt air mixed with old wood and decades of family memories. Nautical stuff everywhere. Jake showed me to my room on the 2nd floor. That first night was perfect. We grabbed sandwiches from this local deli and walked the beach as the sun was setting. Jake brought fishing rods, more for tradition than actually expecting to catch anything, and we found this quiet spot where we could cast into the surf. We stayed out past midnight before finally heading back through these quiet residential streets lined with similar vacation properties. Saturday morning hit us with brilliant sunshine and the steady breeze coming off the ocean. We'd planned to spend the day on the beach, maybe get a run-in along the boardwalk before it got too hot. Jake was always an early riser. The guy was obsessed with his morning workouts, and I'd been trying to stay in some kind of shape, despite sitting at a desk all summer. The day passed in that timeless way beach days do. Hours just melted together as we went back and forth between the ocean and our spot on the sand. By evening, we were both completely wiped, despite doing basically nothing but swimming and lying in the sun. Jake suggested checking out some bars, but neither of us could handle the thought of crowds and loud music. The idea of dealing with weekend tourists and waiting in lines felt overwhelming after a full day of sun exposure. We decided to call it an early night and make the most of our last day before heading back to the city. Sometime after midnight, I jolted awake to this piercing electronic beeping. The sound cut through the quiet house like a knife. Impossible to ignore. My first thought was smoke detector. That skull-penetrating tone that makes you jump out of bed immediately. I threw off the covers and stumbled into the hallway, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The beeping seemed to be coming from above, somewhere on the 3rd floor. I pounded on Jake's door and woke him up. We rushed upstairs together, expecting to find smoke or some obvious emergency. The 3rd floor was dark, except for moonlight filtering through the windows at the end of the hallway. We flipped on lights and started searching every room, looking for signs of fire or some kind of malfunction. The beeping just kept going, relentless, but we couldn't find anything. No smoke, no flickering lights, nothing that would explain what was happening. After several minutes of frantic searching, I found something weird in one of the spare bedrooms. Tucked under a pillow on the bed was this small black device, about the size of a walkie-talkie. Sleek, no markings, just a blinking red light on top and what looked like a switch on the side. I called Jake over and showed him the thing. Neither of us had ever seen it before. Jake swore no family members had been to the house recently. I flipped the switch experimentally, and the beeping stopped immediately. We just stared at each other in the sudden silence, both of us processing what this meant. Jake asked if I recognized it. I told him I'd never seen anything like it. He seemed just as confused, insisting none of his relatives would have left something like this behind. For the next hour, we tried to make sense of what we'd found. The device was a complete mystery, just smooth black casing and that single switch. But what really disturbed us was how it had been activated in the first place. The switch clearly controlled the beeping, which meant someone had to have operated it manually. Sitting in Jake's room with the lights off, I had this chilling realization. I pulled out the device and quickly flipped the switch on and off again. The shrill beeping resumed and stopped exactly as before. We both understood what this meant. The only way to trigger the device was by hand. Someone else had to be in the house. Jake immediately called the police while I started barricading his bedroom door with whatever furniture I could move. We huddled together in the darkness, listening for any sounds that might tell us where the intruder was hiding. When the police finally arrived, we met them at the front door and quickly explained what had happened. They conducted a thorough search while we waited outside on the front porch, until they came back from the third floor with some disturbing news. Every window on the upper level had been opened, including windows in rooms we checked earlier that night. Even worse, the spare bedroom showed signs of disturbance. The room where I'd found the device looked completely ransacked, despite appearing normal when we'd searched it just hours before. The officers found no sign of an intruder. They told us to secure all windows and doors and to call immediately if anything else happened. Then they left us alone with our fears and unanswered questions. Jake and I spent the rest of the night in his locked bedroom, taking turns staying awake to listen for unusual sounds. Neither of us felt safe, but we had nowhere else to go at that hour. We agreed to leave first thing in the morning and cut our weekend short. Fortunately, nothing else happened during those remaining hours of darkness. When dawn finally broke, we packed as quickly as possible and drove straight back home. To this day, neither of us can explain what happened in that house or who might have been playing games with us. It left both of us deeply disturbed. Jake told me recently that he's been trying to convince his family to sell the place